Thank you very much for this invitation. As you heard, Yanni and Kostas and we met before we were ophthalmologists. We met at the Part 1 course, the theoretical course, given by Alistair.
Fiedler.
Yeah.
I think so. Was Fiedler, wasn't it?
Yeah. Fielder.
Something like
Professor of pediatrics now, who plays the saxophone also, and I gave him a lesson that weekend. And Anthony Braun was leading the course. This was in 1991, I believe. So we've known each other a very long time. And so perhaps it sounds a little bit nepotistic for me to be receiving this award, but I hope I can justify it by giving you a little bit of a story of how my career went off. And I'm really aiming this talk at the younger ophthalmologists who have so much opportunity now with the different learning tools, internet tools, ChatGPT, but some of the principles of how to develop an academic career, whether it's inside or outside of a university setting, I hope that I can impart some of this as at least the pathway which I took. And these are my financial disclosures. You have to understand that refractive surgery doesn't exist without financial disclosures because there is no government-sponsored refractive surgery research. It's all privately funded. I was impressed when I was hearing last night about Dr. Vadaka's history because he is one of the first Greeks to have gone to do formal ophthalmology training abroad. And I understand that really the UK is the sort of primary destination for ophthalmologists of his generation. Of course, your younger generation now has the opportunity of studying with people such as on the panel who have had their training abroad and have brought that expertise here to this country, and you're very self-contained now. In my story, I've tried to put together some of the areas which I believe are the areas where I contributed to the field that I decided to work in, which is refractive surgery. And I'm going to talk about each of these 5 areas. First of all, the epithelium. But to understand how this all started, we need to start with how it started. So I graduated from Cambridge in 1989. And I had to write a thesis. And to write that thesis, I had to have a title. And I thought, well, I'm good at physics. I'm not so interested in bacteria. So I'm going to try and do something more physics to do with ophthalmology. And I thought, oh, well, how about lasers? That's physics. And so I did an internet search, and I found a lot of papers, lasers in ophthalmology, by a professor, John Marshall, who was at the Institute of Ophthalmology in London, about 10 minutes walk away from my house. I was living very near UCL. And I wrote to him, and I got a phone call back from one of his fellows. And I explained to him that I had to write a thesis on lasers, and I said, could you send me an envelope with as many publications on lasers and the eye so that I can sort of put together this thesis. So this very kind man on the phone, I received a manila envelope, with about 30 papers in it. And it turns out this guy who sent me the envelope was David Gartrey, who's, at Moorfields, which I know he regrets now sending me that envelope, but still. I was also introduced to Alan Bird by John Marshall because I was hoping, as an American citizen, to take advantage of my U.S. citizenship and perhaps go to New York to do my residency because that's the mecca of jazz. And I'm a jazz musician, and I thought I could combine studying ophthalmology with being in the jazz scene at the same time. So I had Alan Bird write a letter to several programs in New York to see if they would accept me. And I ended up interviewing at Cornell. The story of how I got into this department is interesting also. They said they didn't have it, they would love to have me, but they don't have any funding. So I said, that's okay, I'm willing to work without pay, not forever, but to start. right? So how do you say no to someone who's offering free work who has a reasonable CV? So that's, that's a little trick that you put up under your sleeve. And of course, within a few minutes of arriving, they actually did find some money, not much, but I was paid. Now, the first thing I had to learn how to do was to proptose the eye of an anesthetized rabbit. So you inject ketamine into the gluteus of the animal, and it falls asleep. And then you basically take their eyelids with a hole in the plastic drape, and you push it down, and it's pretty disgusting the first time you do this, and the eye just pops up into this little hole. And it's obviously it's a rubber drape, so it hugs the optic nerve, and so you've got this eye in the middle of a water bath so that you can scan it with this scanner. Now, this scanner was a rectilinear scanner, and it was used for scanning tumors of the iris, tumors of the ciliary body. And that was Jack Coleman's high interest, was melanoma. And they were using tissue characterization to do, diagnostic, prognostic evaluation, without physically biopsying, by doing acoustic biopsy. And it was very, very avant-garde work. But I stayed in the lab one night. I didn't want to just do something that was part of everyone's projects, and then I do something and then I disappear and that's the end. I wanted to find something for me, something that hadn't been done before. So I stayed in the lab one night. I had a little rabbit eye in formalin, so I was scanning it all over the place, left, right, up, down, and I scanned the cornea. And the next morning I said to Ron Silverman, can we make measurements inside here? And he goes, yeah, we have a measurement tool. And this is the tool, and it's on a VAX computer, so you have to type in some line code and move the cursor over, and it's very tedious. You put a window of interest, and you measure the distances between the front and back of the epithelium and the back of the cornea. And so I had a measurement, and I made a bunch of measurements and found that the repeatability was about 1 micron. And so I got up and I went around to the clinic, and I went to the office of Cal Roberts, who was the head of cornea at the time. You know that he then left Cornell, became chief medical officer of Bausch & Lomb for many years, and now he's spearheading a government project worth several trillion, where they're trying to give blind sight. They're doing the ocular implants into the brain, and so he's kept on going up. But so I asked him, "Can I, Dr. Roberts, I'm a research fellow from, could I show you something in the lab?" And he said, "Yes, of course." And he got up and he came with me. And I sat down at the computer and I displayed the scan and I explained to him that I could measure the epithelium with 1 micron precision. And I turned around and I said, would that be of use for something? And he went like this. No. And that moment was like this. Wah, the Simpsons, like the sky just opened up. And I thought, oh my God, I've just found something that has never been measured before, that the professor of cornea at Cornell University said is for nothing, is no point in doing it. I thought, that's perfect, because there must be something it's useful for. And it was literally it was like an explosion in my head. It was like, this is what I'm going to do, come hell or high water. This is my ticket into academics. And so I started, doing a lot of extra work secretly, because I had to continue doing the glaucoma, the tumor stuff. But in the background, I was doing corneal measurements, and I managed to make a map of the cornea. The first map took me 6 weeks because of the analysis time and the plotting time. And I showed it, and I sent it to, I showed it to Jack Coleman. He sent it across the park to Steve Troquel. And Steve Troquel calls me, Steve Troquel is, the god of excimer laser and the cornea, and I'm a research fellow at Cornell that no one even looks at me. The residents just pass me like, foreign graduate, whatever, whoever you are. And he's calling me, and he goes, what am I looking at? I said, well, you're looking at you're looking at the front and back surface of the epithelium, 1 micron precision. He goes, wait a minute, is this histology? I go, no, it's an ultrasound scan. He said, oh my God, I have a hard-on. Don't translate that into Greek. Okay. He said that to me, and I was like, oh, okay. Well, he said, no, I'm sending you a patient tomorrow. I go, no, we've only scanned rabbits. He goes, I'm sending a patient. The patient will arrive at 2 o'clock tomorrow to the lab. Scan him, her. So we quickly were cleaning all the rabbit hair off the bench and vacuuming the room, because it was a lab, right? The patient came, lay down on the bed. We scanned this girl. I remember her name very clearly. This was the topography that she had if she was in the phase 2 trials of the FDA for PRK. This was about to kill the FDA trial, because no one knew what the hell was happening with these topographies. And you couldn't sacrifice the human and do the histology. So they were in big trouble. And the scan, which took me, again, 6 weeks to analyze, showed that where the cornea was steeper, the epithelium was thinner. And on the side of that steep zone where the epithelium was thinning, the epithelium was thicker. So it was showing that the epithelium was filling a trough and thinning over a peak. Vizix went and patented the idea of using a 2 millimeter zone -2 ablation, so that you take extra tissue out of the center, so that the plume-blocked bump was ablated at the end of the procedure. So they kind of did a compensatory ablation to make the surface smooth. And they patented it, and they didn't include my name on it, and they didn't send me a thank you note. But that's okay, because when you're a little junior, you can't say anything. Never the mind. Karma was such that I was at a meeting, and I had my little printed pictures. There was no phones in those days with the pictures. And I was carrying around a folder of printed photographs, and I was walking along, and I saw George Waring, and I wanted to, Dr. Waring, I'm Dan Reinstein. Can I show you something? And he's like, walk with me. And he was like, he's walking like this, and I'm kind of trying to catch up with him, and I'm showing him these images, and I'm saying, I think we got something. He says, wow, that is really great. You should keep on working on that. Boom. Okay? You get the energy from someone of this stature, right? So, about a year later, my friend from the course in Birmingham wrote and said that he wanted to know if there was any work to be done in New York at the lab where I was. And I said, well, actually, this thing is taking off. I need help. So he said, okay. He came over with his lovely wife, Sissy, and they moved into New York, and, Yanni, you all know him, he's an extremely hard worker, and while he was there, came out with a number of publications over a very short period of time. The first one was a letter that we wrote, because the Americans were, the British were saying pachymetry, and the Americans were saying pachymetry, and he arrived in the lab. I said, hold on a second, you're Greek. Is it pachymetry or pachymetry? And so, together with his father Minas, we went through a whole debate, and we wrote a letter to the JRS, which got published, determining that it's pachymetry, because you've never seen a pachyderm. Okay, so that all of that work, of course, culminated in his PhD at an early age, which led to his academic career. And I don't have to tell you how that went, but needed to say, he's done extremely well. So over the years, here we are in 2005 with our mentor, Jack Coleman, and Yanni with a prototype device in his clinic in Greece, which he opened about 20 years ago, I believe, in Metropia. And, here we are a month ago in London with his son, Minas, who is also becoming an ophthalmologist. And, what a wonderful story. So you see, this visit that we had in 2008, where we had our two families together, all the kids, and now we look at 2023, last year, and here I am bringing the World College of Refractive Surgery fellowship certificate to Yanni, to his practice. You can see our families together, and you can see that, well, this is about 15 years apart. And as you can see, it's about 15 kilos apart. Also, we were just commenting on how much better we look now than back then. Anyhow, never forget who's the boss. I have no doubts. We are all very clear about that, so, you know, that's right. All right, now let's get down to business here. Okay, so 1991, I start scanning with this rectilinear. I spent 5 years working on myself, really, building this mechano set with my stepfather's camera stand. He was a National Geographic photographer, Al Moldvay, and I stole that from him from the garage. And I built this mechano set. This is me being scanned. This is the first time we use this. And Ron Silverman does all the computer programming and ultrasonics, so that we could build a working prototype. And this was developed into a first commercial prototype, which then was miniaturized into a second commercial prototype, which didn't work that well. It wasn't well designed. And finally, let's say the final prototype, which is now commercially available and is an extraordinary device with 6 degrees of freedom. It's robotic scanning, doesn't depend on the user, and is very high-frequency ultrasound, and I'm going to talk about that. The main principle behind this instrument and any other high-frequency ultrasound device is that it has simultaneous optical and ultrasound scanning. So because refractive surgery is optical, and it matters where you are when you're scanning. And so having the visual axis, knowing where that is while you're taking corneal scans, is critical to being able to use the data for optical analysis. And likewise, if you're scanning the posterior chamber to do ICLs, for example, knowing where the visual axis is also essential in knowing where you're going to center the ICL and where the dimensions are that you have to measure to get your sizing right. But if you go back to the epithelium, this was a journey because we didn't know what it was for. So obviously the first thing was to characterize the normal epithelium. And then to characterize the normal corneal epithelium on a keratoconic. What is that? And then to see if we can exploit the differences to screen for keratoconus. So nobody had ever seen this. This paper was rejected from ophthalmology by some jealous competitive reviewers who wrote terrible reviews, which I then rebutted, but the editor was biased and rejected the paper. So I sent this paper to George Waring at the JRS, who said, I don't need to review it because it's been reviewed by 2 peer-reviewed reviewers. You've given the answers to everything. We can publish it next week. So he published this. This is my highest cited paper. Yes, the epithelium is about 50 microns thick in the middle, but what was not known was that on average, the epithelium is thicker inferiorly than superiorly and thicker nasally than temporally. That was not known because you never measured it with 1 micron precision. Obviously, we know that in keratoconus, the cone gets thinner epithelium, but we didn't know that around the cone, the epithelium gets thicker. So this configuration of a donut shape of epithelium starts to become pathognomonic with diagnosing keratoconus. But of course, if you know that a cornea is keratoconic and you take a scan, who cares? You already knew it was keratoconic. The real question is, what if you're not sure it's keratoconic? What if you look at this and you say, well, that's a lot of inferior steepening. I don't know if I can do corneal refractive surgery on this patient. Well, it's very easy. You get an epithelial map. Because you see, if the epithelium is thicker where the elevation cone is, then this cannot be keratoconus. It cannot. Because you cannot have an elevation of the stromal surface without thinning of the epithelium over that. It cannot happen. And therefore, it is diagnostic of rejecting keratoconus in this elevation. The elevation, this increased curvature, is due to the thickening of the epithelium, not keratoconus. This is key fact. And I'll explain to you how key it is. We got a $3 million grant from the NIH to do a machine learning model. And this was before 2010. We published this paper 2014, finally. And Ron Silverman, who's a professor of AI, basically it was called machine learning at the time, we did a stepwise linear discriminant analysis. We had 161 variables that we came up with, and we ended up with a 6-variable model that had 99% specificity on keratoconus, 99%, and 95% sensitivity, picking it up. There's nothing out there, this is just the epithelium, not using any other parameters. So you could actually throw away all your tomographers and topographers and just use epithelial maps to screen for refractive surgery. Obviously, we don't want to do that, but let me give you an example. It's a 37-year-old hyperope with a flat cornea and 2012 best corrected, with a normal topography. Actually, it's a normal tomography. The BAD, big D, is 0.61. It's totally normal. But this is the high-frequency ultrasound scans. And you can see that the epithelium has a donut shape, and the standard, so the deviation from normality plot also has a depression. And that is exactly where the minimal elevation of the posterior surface is, an amount that is not raising suspicion in a statistical model of back surface curvature, the BADD. So the BADD says this is normal, but the epithelium is more sensitive because it's showing us a donut pattern. And the algorithm, this AI algorithm, shows you that this is definitely a keratoconic cornea. So you see, ectasia without a cause, there's no such thing. It's you had normal tomography and topography, and you did LASIK and it got ectasia. That's not a cause. That's you didn't measure the epithelium. So anyone doing refractive surgery in 2024 without measuring the epithelium is very exposed if a case came up against you, because the technology has been around for almost 10 years commercially. It's almost you will lose the case, because you can have totally normal topographies with clearly keratoconic subsurface stromal surfaces indicated by epithelial maps. And yeah, it might be 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 3,000, but it's worth it, because one ectasia is 1,000 times worse than no ectasia. And you can have cases, but this is the most important thing really for commercial purposes. That's safety. But if we talk about commercial purposes, you can have corneas that have been classified by the device as being keratoconic, but you can prove that they're not keratoconic by showing that the epithelium is thicker where the steepening of the cornea is. So this is kind of like a black and white litmus test. The epithelium's thicker, it's not keratoconus. So you do LASIK in this patient which says suspect keratoconus, very confidently. The patient ends up with ectasia, probably eye rubbing. You go to court, and the other side says, look, you see, it said suspect keratoconus. And you say, no, you haven't read the literature. The epithelium was thicker over that region. It could not have been keratoconus. This man was eye rubbing. End of discussion. Yeah, so it is, because we're talking about the real deal, which is epithelial thickness changes which can be detected with 1 micron precision, whereas a 1 micron change on the back surface of the cornea gets lost in statistics because the back surface is not that accurate, especially with the pentagon. So we published a paper with 1-year follow-up of operating on these eyes where the machine said suspect keratoconus, but the epithelium excluded keratoconus. And that was 1,500 eyes, used the orb scan for the back surface and the atlas for the front surface, and we found that about 10% were suspect, which is what you always see in every day in your practice. But those patients went for Artemis scanning, and they had an epithelial map, and we found that 16% of them actually did have keratoconus, but 84% of them didn't have keratoconus. Now, what does that mean? That means that, well, 84% of 9% is 7%. In other words, we have a 7% increase in surgical volume because we have epithelial mapping. Now, when I showed this early, when was this? 2009, that is when David Huang, the master genius of OCT and an eye surgeon, he said, okay, we're going to adapt this ROCT to measure epithelium. And I started working with him, with the company. And now we have, obviously many devices that are measuring epithelium, some of them better than others. If you want the truth, kind of the only two that can do it accurately are the MS-39 and the Avanti. The others can do it, but not well. And they're all approved. Now, in my own clinic, I have an Avanti, but I have 3 Cirrus machines, and I have 6 MS-39s. One of them is at my desk, because this is my slit lamp of the 20th century, and this is my slit lamp of the 21st century. I use it as a high-resolution slit lamp to look at cross-sections of the cornea, the anterior segment, and I can make measurements, and I can brighten, and it's a far better tool than taking photographs with a white split beam of a slit lamp, and it gives me much more diagnostic power than I would have had before. So for the young ones, you see, when you invent something or you discover something that no one thinks is of any use, you go through the 3 stages of discovery that Schopenhauer, the German philosopher, described. First, totally ignored. Second, violently opposed. And third, accepted as inherently obvious. And if I was having a beer with Schopenhauer, I would say, Arthur, there's a 4th stage. And he would say, what? And I would say, the 4th stage is everybody thinks it was their idea. Right? But you see, during the 1st stage, my 1st stage was so long, 1st and 2nd stage, I published 45 peer-reviewed papers just on the epithelium of the cornea in the human in vivo. So that was brilliant tactic, right? You do something that everyone doesn't pay attention to. And it wasn't that I wasn't talking at meetings. I was going to meetings 5-6 times a year, but people ignored it. And in total, we've so far published 58 papers. Amongst the very first observations, which I already alluded to earlier, was something we presented at ARVO in '94. And from analyzing complex refractive surgical complications, these were keratomileusis, keratomileusis in situ, PRKs, we realized that the epithelium always changes when there's an irregular stroma. So I would say the law of epithelial compensation is that if there is irregular astigmatism, irregular topography, there is irregular epithelium by definition. Because if an eye presents with irregular topography, by definition, the epithelium has reached its maximum compensatory function. It can't compensate more, so you're left with surface irregularity. So you cannot have an irregular topography with a regular epithelium. And let me just point out that my brother over here from 30 years ago, he was part of this poster and a lot of the analysis that we did late at night. So this then comes to what I coined as the rules of epithelial healing. We are currently working, we're developing an AI model, but we need to tell it what to expect. We're telling it that the epithelium fills depressions. We're telling it that it thins over peaks. We're telling it that the epithelial change is proportional to stromal change, how much stroma you took out, and it's definitely proportional to the rate of change of curvature of the stromal surface. So with many thousand eyes being fed in here and pre-training it, if you like, with boundary conditions that are the rules of epithelial healing, we're now developing models. Okay, so that's enough about epithelium, and my closest friends who've known me for all these years, they say, well, yeah, Reinstein, he's very superficial. 50 microns deep, that's as far as I go. Now, now, this keratoconus screening, I don't want you to go away thinking I only need epithelial mapping, because the fact is, and Renato Ambrosio, very good friend, he coined the concept of the multimodal approach. So obviously with Bellin, they have the Bellin-Ambrosio display, which is highly sensitive, but not very specific. We have Damien Gottinel, who did another sort of tomography for the orb scan, and now I believe it's in the Anterion. And we have the Vincigueras, who worked with Oculus to develop Corvis and to develop parameters that are biomechanical to try and distinguish between soft and stiff corneas. Of course, there's the contribution of the epithelium, and all of this comes together when you have two machines. You have an MS-39 with epithelium and everything together, and a Corvis with a pentagon, because you have to have the TBI. And so when you have that, you have not just a morphological diagnostic filter, but you now have a biomechanical filter which adds information. None of these devices is 100% sensitive and 100% accurate, but when you join all of these modalities, your probability of operating on a keratoconic cornea goes down to almost zero, and you will increase your volume of surgery because you'll use your epithelium as proof that that abnormal topography is not keratoconus. So looking at the anatomy a little bit below the 50 micron mark, and we started looking at complications. And I want to show you this slide, which I showed at ASCRS in 1999, was part of a 2-hour monologue course, a little bit like this afternoon, the 2-hour monologue I'm about to give. And we were talking about how if you can't measure it, you don't know what you're doing. Topography doesn't tell you anything. If I was to hold my stomach in it and just button myself up like this, you don't know how much I weigh. But if I took my clothes off, you'd be much more accurate. So the point here is we need to look beneath the skin. And we started doing this. And to be honest, this was so difficult and exciting because we didn't even know what we were looking at. We were looking at these multiple lines inside the cornea, and we'd have to work out from the history, what the hell, what is this? What is that? What is this? Where's the epithelium? And these two papers, again, are some of my most cited papers because they were early on and they were exposing a real problem that we had in refractive surgery. And I knew we didn't have the solutions yet, but we were at least exposing that what the problem was. And it wasn't until a few years later that I moved to London with my Artemis 1, and a 58-year-old engineer from NASA came over, having had multiple procedures in his left eye, and was left with what looked like a reasonable, the orb scan looked fine, and the surgeon's telling him, there's nothing we can do, you're fine. You're minus a half, there's nothing we can do. And he said, I have to wear a patch because it looks like I'm looking through wax on this eye, and it's driving me nuts. And his contrast was super low, and his aberrations were not even that high. So his aberrations weren't high. The contrast was low. The topography looked normal. It was a diagnostic conundrum. But when you look at the ultrasound scan, you see right away that Bowman's is quite irregular. And if you do it in 3 dimensions, you see that actually there are multiple circles, thin, thick, thin, thick, thin. That is like an array lens of epithelium sitting on the stroma. Well, do you remember what patients complained of when you put the array lens in? Waxy vision. It's exactly the same words that he gave me. And knowing the theory of transepithelial PTK, I did a PTK on him, and there it is. This is the stroma after 1 PTK. Look how regularized the stromal surface is now. Look how the topography became much more regular. The aberrations actually went down, and the contrast went back to normal. So again, anatomy, diagnosis, then you know what to do, then you fix it. That's the process. Here's the stromal map before, stromal map afterwards, and the tissue that would have been virtually impossible to take away even today by a topography-guided treatment, getting that kind of accuracy. So I want to move on to the other area, which is this one of ICL sizing. It's a very interesting area because in my book, the science of optimal ICL surgery is to do with sizing, because the procedure itself is 1/20th of a cataract procedure, so anybody can do it. And the technology is amazing. I mean, the visual quality of these patients is unsurpassed. So the problem we have is sizing. And the reason why it only has 1 or 2% of the whole market, I believe, is because people are scared of the outliers. And no one wants to step into a pond and get their foot bitten off by an alligator. So we just don't put the foot in the pond. And people do 20, 30 ICLs, and then they get this massive volt, pressure goes to 60, you're freaking out, there's aqueous misdirection, the eye might go blind. I'm never doing that again. And that's what I believe is holding back the ICL. But here we go. So for all these years, the ICL sizing has been done by white to white, which leads to these extreme problems in about, well, it depends on who you talk to, about 5% of patients. Saldivar, who's put in 27,000 ICLs, says that even today, with his expertise in sizing, about 30% of the ICLs are not the size that he wishes they were. In other words, you can leave it in, but it's not ideal. And the notion that the low volt with the hole is fine because you won't get a cataract is not quite supported because these small number of publications saying no cataract, there are cataracts. This is a case of mine. We do see some cataracts. There are other reasons for cataract, like viscoelastic retained and toxicity to the lens, trauma to the lens. So, because the lens itself can rub against the as it's opening. But here's the key. The key is that we're not looking in the right place. You see, everyone's measuring white to white. Now, white to white is up here, and the lens is going in the posterior chamber. Now, it's quite far away. The white to white is quite far away. But the angle to angle is closer. So you would expect the angle to angle to be better. But here, let me show you. Here's an eye where the sulcus diameter and the angle diameter are the same. Here's a case where the sulcus diameter is larger than the angle diameter, which is common. But here's a case where the sulcus diameter is smaller than the angle. And these differences are sufficient to flip onto a different size lens. There's only 4 lenses. And then in addition, there's the other crocodile, which is the iris cysts. And you cannot find them without ultrasound, obviously, unless it's an albino, in which case you can use OCT and there's no pigment. But these crocodiles, this is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid the hidden problems in the posterior chamber. Carlo Lovisolo was the first to publish a textbook on ICL. It's a 500-page textbook published in 1999. And he was already insisting that sizing had to be done by sulcus to sulcus measurements. He and I worked with an Artemis II together and showed definitively that sulcus sizing is way better than white to white sizing. No question about it, end of discussion. He was looking at the mechanics, the mechanics of this lens, the compression mechanics, the FEM models, because it turns, the higher myopic lenses are thinner in the middle but thicker in the periphery. The thin, low myopic lenses are thin everywhere, so that the way they bend is different under compression. Now, sadly, as you all know, Carlo got a glioblastoma and died within a year. This was me visiting him when he was well after his neurosurgery. And so the work was left to be finished. And I, having not been doing ICLs yet, decided to I tried to find someone in London to cooperate with me, but no one wanted to. And so I said, right, I'm going to do it myself. So with Tim Archer and Ryan Vida, we discovered that there are 3 parameters. 3 parameters which give you the highest accuracy in volt prediction that we've seen so far. And one of them is new. The ciliary body inner diameter. That's the diameter between the inner aspect of the ciliary body is much stronger than the sulcus to sulcus in predicting. In fact, it completely surpasses the use of the sulcus. If Carlo were alive, we would be drinking an amazing Barolo in his brother's vineyard near Milan. And let me just compare here the formula based on ciliary body inner diameter with the sulcus formulas, the anterior chamber formulas, and obviously the star formula. And as you can see, the interquartile range of the volt is significantly smaller. That range is significantly smaller if we use ciliary body inner diameter sizing. And obviously the range of top to bottom is much smaller than with any other method. That means that we have 61% of the eyes within 100 microns of predicted. We have 96% of the eyes within 300 microns of predicted. And let's compare this to star with a white to white. That's way lower. But yes, and OCT is better than, like, the angle is closer to the posterior chamber than the white to white, so it is better. But it's nowhere near as good as measuring directly in the posterior chamber. That's kind of obvious, but anyway. So what are we doing now? Well, of course, people want convenience and workflow and, you know, throughput in the clinic. And so ultrasound is deemed to be a bit difficult. It's a bit cumbersome. Doesn't fit my busy practice. And so we're trying to see if we can use AI with OCT imaging to somehow to predict the posterior chamber dimensions without measuring them directly. And maybe AI can do it, right? AI can distinguish a man from a woman just from a retinal scan, apparently now. And the Saldivars are working on using not just anterior segment, but also ultrasound, either low-frequency ultrasound, the UBM, or the high-frequency digital ultrasound from the Insight 100 from ArcScan. But here's really the logic, right? You can measure your white to white, and you're going to get a distribution of volt measurements, and you're going to have the outliers on the tails, and these are going to be fat tails, right? And your exchange rate depends on how tolerant you are or how daring you are to leave something in an eye. There are surgeons like me who had an exchange rate of 5% with white to white, and others just 1%. Not that I'm not doing the surgery correctly, it's just that I won't leave a lens in that's too low or too high and see how it goes, whereas many would. But if you go closer to the posterior chamber and use the angle with OCT, of course, the scatter of the measurements goes down. It goes down. You're closer to the real value. But that doesn't necessarily get rid of the outliers where the posterior chamber dimensions do not comply with the anterior chamber dimensions. It's, you know, some people have short legs and long trunks. And some people have short trunks and long legs. And those are outliers if you're looking at doing a ratio of leg to trunk. Those are the outliers, right? And so if you use ultrasound to look behind the iris, which is exactly where you're putting the lens, and you're not estimating from a model what the posterior chamber dimensions are, you're measuring the posterior dimensions directly, well, clearly there's a potential for eliminating the outliers, particularly as you'll also be able to find where the cysts are. And based on the implantation angles, you know that the foot plates are 23 degrees away from the horizontal of the lens, so you know where that foot plate is going. And if it's where a cyst is going to be, you can order the lens, you know, turned 23 degrees so that the middle of the lens is at the cyst and the foot plates are not interfering with cysts. So the whole story here is, you know, don't get caught out by the outlier gators. The white to white will probably not show you the outliers. OCT will show you some, but if you drain the swamp by looking in the posterior chamber, you're going to see where all the alligators are. And I thought but that's the Florida version, and I'm now going to do the Greek version. And the Greek version is, you know, the marathon from Marathon to Athens, 42 kilometers. You get the bronze if you use white to white. It's fine. It's still a medal. You're going to do fine. But you get silver if you're using AI with OCT. And if you really want to operate, if you want to be able to say to a patient directly in their eyes, I'm going to use the most sophisticated method of making your ICL surgery as safe as is possible today, you have to be using high-frequency ultrasound. Interestingly, Professor Izbeska from the Medical University of Warsaw, she asked me if she could use her formula with her Quantella Viso, because she is using this for years. She's extremely experienced in scanning. She uses sulcus to sulcus sizing. I said, I don't know, you can try it. Well, these were her results. She was very excited because she was getting much better sizing with her so-called, the machine says 50 megahertz, but it's actually 30. And she was getting much better results. But we did a statistical comparison with equivalency with high-frequency ultrasound, and obviously a high-frequency ultrasound with a higher resolution to detect the cellular body inner diameter is much better.
Move on a little bit more.
Yeah.
Move on.
Finally, the intraoperative measurements, because the haptics can end up in many different places. And so one of the projects that we've done is to use intraoperative OCT to develop a model that will predict from an intraoperative measurement, it's multivariate, what the volt will be at the 1 month mark. And my son Max did this all by himself, no nepotism. His model predicts 100% of the eyes within 300 microns of where they're going to end up. And this gives you the opportunity to do an exchange on the table so that the patient only experiences one surgery, even though it was 2 lenses. And that's psychologically and for many reasons, morbidity-wise, much better. Finally, being able to monitor the position of the lens, which may not be even. You can now, with high-frequency ultrasound, do a volt map of where the lens is closest to the crystalline lens. So I'm going to finish off with presbyopia, which is actually the biggest subject in the world right now. And everyone's always arguing about whether you do. I saw the talks earlier. I didn't understand them. My Greek is very limited. But, you know, it's cornea versus lens, and nobody, we're not talking to each other. It's like 2 different planets speaking 2 different languages. And I propose to you that this is not the model. It's not cornea versus lens. It's not 2 planets. It's 3 planets. And the 3 planets are not cornea versus lens. They are multifocality, EDOF by spherical aberration, and monovision. Those are the 3 planets. Multifocality in IOLs, corneal implants, corneal inlays, multifocal corneas, monovision with simple cataract surgery or LASIK, but EDOF done by spherical aberration with a microanisotropia gives people binocular vision with stereo preserved. And so this is a modified binocular vision. And 20 years after we started doing this in the mid-2000s, now we have IOLs that are coming around to realizing that EDOF with spherical aberration is better than multifocality and better than monovision. And so the lens manufacturers have caught up, let's say, to what we started doing in the cornea 20 years ago. So now everyone knows the word EDOF. We were doing this 20 years ago on the cornea. And how it was discovered is published. We did a study where we were doing wavefront guided repairs, and we found that we could decrease the spherical aberration of an aberrated eye by only 27%, and yet their contrast sensitivity ratio went to normal. In other words, we could leave spherical aberration in the eye, significant, but they had good contrast. And that was the moment where we thought, hey, we can use this spherical aberration as an EDOF. And that's where we measured in this study, the maximum level of the post-ops was 0.56. So we said, let's just call it 0.6. So that's what we know now. That's what we started. That was our model for developing Presbyond. And a few years later, Carolina, she was working at the Cole Institute, and she used adaptive optics system to put spherical aberration in the pathway of a human eye, and she showed that you can have positive spherical aberration increasing the depth of field, or negative spherical aberration increasing depth of field. It doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative. This is not, in other words, it's not explainable by the pupil size. If you have, negative spherical aberration, the pupil gets smaller, you become more myopic. That's not how it works, because the pupil gets smaller in accommodation anyway when there's positive spherical aberration, and that should become more hyperopic. But it works in both directions. So we coined the concept that spherical aberration is a useful drug. And you can put it in the therapeutic range to get depth of field, but if you put too much, you get loss of contrast and night vision disturbances. So let's go back to this concept. The three modalities all of them can be done in the cornea or lens, but both lens and cornea domains are starting to realize that the best method to have a static solution for the loss of a dynamic process called accommodation is to use spherical aberration for EDOF. And the results of these not weird profiles, these are linear and they are smooth, there's no discontinuities, there's no bump in the middle of the cornea. The results are extraordinary. Why? Because LASIK is extraordinary. LASIK is very accurate. And so we're piggybacking onto the back of an extremely accurate procedure using small modifications to the profile to control spherical aberration. And there are now more than 15 publications from around the world on this. From 250 centers, there's been 1/3 procedures performed. And 2 years ago, we published this paper in military and commercial pilots who required Class 1 certification, and they designed a questionnaire as to what the difficulties are with their glasses and contact lenses and why they were coming for surgery, and filled out the same questionnaire afterwards. And as you can see, we made pilots safer. We made pilots safer by doing presbyond on them. This is also the reason why, as we started teaching our course, so many surgeons have chosen, even though they're doing multifocal implants themselves, have chosen to have presbyond in their eyes because they want to maintain stereo acuity, they want to maintain binocularity, and it's a LASIK procedure which they know is far safer than intraocular surgery. And I've used it to get close to all of my last few slides, to get close to all of my jazz idols, Chick Corea, John McLaughlin, Ron Carter, Victor Bailey, Bill Evans. This is one of the ways I've been putting my two lives together with the two. And obviously I've had it in my own eyes. I see, like when I was 20, I see 20/10 at distance. I see J1 at close. I have 40 seconds of uncorrected stereo acuity up close, and my contrast sensitivity is normal, and I feel like I did when I was 20 years old playing the saxophone at Club Med, although of course I don't exactly look like that anymore, but I see that way. So this whole concept is now being seen to react into the industry. So all of these multifocal corneas are becoming more spherical aberration. All of these multifocal IOLs are becoming more spherical aberration. And so that is where it's going. And I won't take much time to tell you about SMILE because although I was a part of the development, this is a hyper-mature procedure that I don't have to explain. There's been 10 million procedures. All of the aspects of the learning curve have been solved. There are more than 1,000 publications on this procedure in 10 years. It's one of the most published procedures in the history of refractive surgery. And of course, Zeiss is now onto their 2nd generation machine. The other companies are on their 1st generation machine with their advantage of being able to read our textbook and learn from our lecturing. So we're at a position where, all of my career, back to the young guys here, started off with, hard brute force work. And then I hired some help. I hired Tim Archer, and we started magnifying our capabilities to publish. Then with further support, optometrists who were researchers, Ruchi and Joseph now. And just to put this into perspective, this looks impressive. It does if you plot it like this. But the real perspective is if you, for example, you compare me to Jorge Alio. I'm like an amoeba compared to Jorge. So just to make sure that we're all in sync here. And I want to finish with another key to the success of a happy career, and that is your work family. If you treat the people you work with respect, and you give them career progression within your organization, and you listen to them, and you also get rid of the bad apples quickly so that they don't make the other apples bad, You have to have a dynamic process of, we have staff, most of our staff have been with us for more than 10 or 15 years. And that's a loyalty that they have because of our philosophy and the way we treat them. We took them to Malta in 2003. We went to Cape Town 2 years before. We went to New York. A few years before, we went to Las Vegas. We've said, this is the goal for this year. Everyone works to it. We make the goal. We take 45 people around the world for a 4-day weekend. We are treating them with respect. And how did I get all these ideas? I didn't. All of this came from Craig Engelfried, who I was at boarding school with when I was 12. And it was with Craig that we started London Vision Clinic 22 years ago. And my aim was to do the highest possible quality of care, and his aim was to be the highest possible quality of employer. And together, we thought we would give the best possible service and outcomes to our patients. And this is impossible to not mention Glenn Karp, who was my first fellow in London, and obviously stayed with me, and he's been with me for 17 years, and he's a huge force. So that's my work family, and I'll finish with my blood family. This is December 21. This is the last time the whole family was in one picture all together. There's 2 people not in the picture anymore. My father, Jerry, died a month after this picture was taken. And I just want to say the honor of coming to speak to such a historic bed of ophthalmology. Even the name is Greek, and to be invited by people that I met when I was a young researcher, and we were all very starry-eyed, and we're all very happy with our careers, and we hope that all of the young ones here are going to be inspired at least by the kind of energy and dedication that we showed. Thank you very much.